As I grew up in a family where my dad was very hearing impaired, and hearing aids at that point were minimally helpful, more than an ear trumpet, I became aware very early on of how needy people are who are hearing impaired. And then as I grew older and began to develop this hereditary hearing loss, which is progressive more and more, I learned what he felt like, what it felt like to be part of this group. And this is a huge group. You know, when I first realized that I was hearing impaired, I was very young, but you have to get to a certain degree before you can actually be helped by a hearing aid. And, you know, my dad was still with us. He hadn't passed at that point. And he came to me and he said, "You need a hearing aid. You need to go get one, because the longer you wait and the more hearing you lose, the harder it's going to be for you to adjust to hearing again." What happens when you are hearing impaired, and this happened to me later as my hearing impairment progressed, you tend to become more isolated. For years, I would not eat my lunch in the cafeteria, because if I did, I would come back to work afterwards with a headache. And so I isolated and had my lunch in a conference room or at my desk. You know, I was really fortunate because the hearing loss I have in my right ear was worse than the one in my left ear. And so my audiologist recommended a cochlear implant. About 10 months later, I couldn't hear as well anymore, and I found out that the implants had been recalled. So that meant I was going to have to undergo surgery yet again. And that was in late 2019, and then, of course, we had COVID. So I never really was able to have the surgery until last summer. So it was really a blessing to have to go through that twice. But it really made me more sensitive again to how hard it is for the hearing impaired, because I had been able to hear, and suddenly it was almost gone. I became more isolated. I mean, it was COVID, so we were home. But I mean, it was just isolated even for my family. You know, this is what the hearing impaired do to protect themselves from extra stress, because otherwise they will have headaches and other things because they just can't deal with it. A couple of years ago, my church became involved with High Rock, and we were looking for a pastor, so we were using the High Rock videos, which was great. But my congregation has a number of elderly who also tend to have more hearing loss, and they were telling me that they couldn't hear, they couldn't understand what was said on the videos. I decided to write an email to Pastor Dave and explain to him the size of this unique group that was not being able to fully hear God's word presented in the sermons. And could you please have that happen? And he said he thought it was a great idea, way to reach more people, but High Rock just didn't have the personnel resources to do it. And then he said, "Well, can you think of anyone at your church who might be willing to volunteer to help out?" And I wrote back and said, "Well, I can't speak for anyone else. You know, I'd be willing to help out." And soon after, I began proofreading the captions, which are auto-generated. So just this little piece is helping to expand the word that's getting out there to people who desperately need to hear it. For instance, so here we are, the community of the hearing impaired. This was the primary draw for me to become involved in, the High Rock services, and that's wonderful. But if I were to dream about something in the future, I would love if we could do an adult education small group or some way to help hearing people communicate better with those who are hearing impaired, because it would make life so much better for everyone. And it would allow God's word to go out even farther than it has now. Because right now, I promise you, there are hearing impaired people in the congregations of the High Rock churches who are missing stuff. And perhaps that could be helpful to them and to those that they live with especially. We need peace in our life. That's what I get from the High Rock services. But everybody in the pews needs peace as well. And that would be a dream of mine, to spread God's peace.